I never want kids, the Millionaire CEO declared, so she walked away, pregnant. 5 years later, he found her again. They're twins, sons. A great story for my beautiful family. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's start the most powerful story together. 5 years ago. The words that destroy a soul always come wrapped in ordinary moments, delivered by the person you love most when you least expect them. Serena Bunn smoothed her hands over the midnight blue dress that hugged her curves perfectly. The same dress Wallace had chosen for her on their weekend in Napa Valley. Tonight felt different, electric with possibility, heavy with the secret she carried like a precious jewel in her heart. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Wallace Galbraith's penthouse, Seattle's skyline glittered like scattered diamonds, but nothing could outshine the joy bubbling inside her chest. 2 pink lines, 2 beautiful, life-changing pink lines that had appeared on the pregnancy test just that morning. She touched her still flat stomach, imagining the tiny miracles growing inside. Twins. The doctor had confirmed it with a smile that rivaled the sunrise. After 6 months of loving Wallace Galbraith with every fibre of her being, after nights when he whispered her name like a prayer and mornings when he looked at her as if she'd hung the stars themselves, she was carrying his children. "You're glowing tonight," Wallace said, emerging from his study with that devastating smile that had first stolen her breath at the charity gala where they'd met. His dark hair was slightly mussed from running his fingers through it, a habit she'd grown to love during his late-night business calls. At 30, Wallace Galbraith commanded boardrooms and conquered markets with the same intensity he brought to everything else, including loving her. "Am I?" Serena's voice carried a musical lilt that made him pause, wineglass halfway to his lips. The penthouse around them spoke of his success: Italian leather, original artwork, a kitchen that had never seen a home-cooked meal until Serena started staying over. But tonight, none of it mattered. Tonight was about their future, about the family they would build together. Wallace set down his wine and crossed to her, his movements fluid and confident. Even in casual clothes, dark jeans, and a cream cashmere sweater, he carried himself like royalty. When he reached for her hands, she noticed his were slightly trembling. "Serena, there's something I need to discuss with you." Her heart skipped. Was he going to propose? The timing would be perfect. She could share her news right after, watch his face transform with wonder and joy. She'd dreamed of this moment, planned how she'd tell him about the babies. "I've been thinking about us," he continued, leading her to the plush sofa that faced the windows. "About our future." "So have I," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving toward her stomach before she caught herself. Wallace sat beside her, his blue eyes serious in a way that should have warned her. "You know how much you mean to me. These past 6 months have been incredible. You've brought something to my life I didn't know I was missing." Warmth flooded through her. This was it. This was the moment their real life would begin. "But I need to be completely honest with you about something." His voice dropped, taking on the tone he used in business meetings when delivering ultimatums. "I need you to understand my position on children." The word children hit her like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain calm. Maybe he was worried about timing, about being ready. She could reassure him, tell him that love made people ready, that they would figure it out together. "Wallace, I never want kids, Serena." The words fell between them like shards of broken glass. "Not now, not ever. Children would destroy everything I've built, everything I've worked for. They're a complication I can't afford, a responsibility that would consume the life I've carefully constructed." The blood drained from her face so quickly she felt dizzy. Around them, the penthouse suddenly felt cold, cavernous, more like a museum than a home. The city lights beyond the windows blurred as tears gathered in her eyes. She tried to speak, but her voice had abandoned her. "I know society expects certain things," Wallace continued, oblivious to her distress, warming to his subject the way he did when explaining business strategies. Marriage, children, the whole domestic scenario. "But I've seen what that does to people. My parents' marriage barely survived my childhood. My father's business suffered because he was constantly distracted by family obligations. I refuse to make those mistakes." Each word was a knife, twisting deeper. Serena pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling suddenly sick. The babies, their babies, weren't even born yet, and their father was already rejecting them. "The beauty of what we have," Wallace said, reaching for her hand, "is that we can love each other without those complications. We can travel, build our careers, enjoy life without the burden of raising children. We can be selfish with our time, our attention, our resources. Burden." He'd called children a burden. "What if," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "what if children were already part of the equation?" Wallace's expression hardened. "Then that someone would need to make a choice, me or them, because I won't compromise on this, Serena. I won't pretend to want something that would fundamentally change who I am and what my life represents." The finality in his voice shattered something inside her chest. This wasn't a discussion or a negotiation. This was a declaration, as unchangeable as the laws of physics. Wallace Galbraith, the man she loved with every breath in her body, would never want their children, would see them as obstacles to overcome rather than blessings to cherish. "I see," she managed, proud that her voice didn't break entirely. "I knew you'd understand." Wallace smiled, the same smile that had made her believe in fairy tales and forever. "That's what I love about you. You're practical, ambitious. You understand that some dreams are worth protecting, even if it means sacrificing others." But she wasn't practical. She was a woman who painted watercolor sunrises and cried at romantic movies, and had been foolish enough to believe that love could conquer anything. She was a woman carrying twins who would never know their father's love because he'd decided they didn't deserve it before they'd even drawn their first breath. "I should go," she said, standing on unsteady legs. "Go?" Wallace frowned. "But I made reservations at Canlis. I thought we'd celebrate." "Celebrate what?" The question escaped before she could stop it, bitter and broken. "Us, our future, the fact that we want the same things." But they didn't want the same things. They never had. She'd just been too blinded by love to see it. "I need some air," she lied, already moving toward the door. "I'll call you tomorrow." "Serena, wait." But she was already gone, fleeing down the hallway, into the elevator, away from the man who'd just unknowingly rejected his own children. In the elevator's mirrored walls, she saw her reflection, pale, stricken, her hand protectively curved over her stomach. That night, in her small apartment across town, Serena packed her life into 3 suitcases. Every photograph of them together, every gift he'd given her, every reminder of the love that had turned to ash in the space of a single conversation. She left it all behind. At dawn, she drove out of Seattle with tears streaming down her face and 2 tiny hearts beating inside her. She didn't leave a note. She didn't say goodbye. She simply vanished, taking Wallace's children, the children he never wanted, to a place where they would be loved completely, unconditionally, by the one parent who already adored them. Behind her, the city grew smaller in her rearview mirror. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also hope. She would raise Julian and Louis to know they were wanted, cherished, worthy of every sacrifice she would make. They would never know the pain of being seen as burdens by the man who'd helped create them. The words that had shattered everything would remain unspoken in their presence. Her children would know only love. Present day. Some wounds never heal. They just learn to whisper instead of scream. Chapter 2. 5 years later. A man can build an empire with his hands, but it takes a woman's absence to teach him what wealth really means. Wallace Galbraith stood in his corner office on the 52nd floor of the Galbraith Tower, but for once, the commanding view of Seattle's bustling financial district held no appeal. The quarterly reports spread across his mahogany desk showed record profits. His latest acquisition had been featured on the cover of Fortune, and at 35, he commanded a business empire worth more than some small country's GDP. Yet none of it mattered without her. 5 years, 1,826 days since Serena had walked out of his life without explanation, leaving behind only the ghost of her perfume and a silence that had never stopped echoing through his carefully constructed world. Every weekend for 5 years, Wallace had driven to a different town, walked through farmers' markets and school playgrounds, sat in coffee shops and bookstores, searching faces in crowds for the woman who'd vanished with his heart. He'd hired private investigators initially, but when they'd failed, he'd taken up the search himself with the same methodical determination he brought to business deals. Portland, Bend, Astoria, Eugene. Dozens of small towns up and down the Pacific coast, each one holding the possibility that this might be the weekend he'd finally see her again. His assistant had long since stopped questioning his Friday departures and Monday returns, accepting that her workaholic boss had developed an inexplicable need to spend weekends exploring the region. This Saturday morning found him in Willowbrook, a picturesque coastal town 3 hours north of Seattle that he'd somehow missed in his earlier searches. The main street was lined with art galleries and cafes, the kind of place that attracted creative types seeking inspiration and affordable rent. Exactly the kind of place Serena might have chosen to start over. Wallace parked near the town square and began his familiar ritual, walking slowly through the commercial district, studying every face, listening for a laugh that might be hers, hoping for the miracle that had sustained him through 5 years of disappointment. The elementary school playground was busy with Saturday morning activities, parents pushing children on swings while others organized what looked like a community cleanup day. Wallace found himself drawn to the cheerful chaos, something about the scene tugging at memories of conversations with Serena about the family life she'd dreamed of having someday. And then he saw her. Serena stood beside a picnic table covered with art supplies, her dark hair caught up in a messy bun, wearing faded jeans and a paint-splattered t-shirt. She was laughing at something a small boy had said, her face radiant with the same joy that had first captured Wallace's heart 6 years ago. She was more beautiful than his memory had dared preserve, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. But it was the children flanking her that made his world tilt on its axis. 2 identical little boys, perhaps 5 years old, with dark hair that fell in waves exactly like his own and blue eyes that mirrored his perfectly. They were helping her organize paintbrushes, their small faces serious with concentration, and when one of them looked up and smiled, Wallace felt his knees go weak. The timeline clicked into place with devastating clarity. 5 years since Serena had left. These boys who looked exactly like him at that age, who moved with gestures he recognized from his own childhood photos. The way Serena's hand rested protectively on one boy's shoulder, the casual intimacy that spoke of years of shared life. These were his children, his sons, the children Serena had been carrying when he'd delivered his cruel ultimatum about never wanting kids. Wallace stood frozen at the edge of the playground, watching the family he'd never known existed. One of the boys, he could see a small scar on the child's chin that distinguished him from his twin, was showing Serena a painting he'd created, his face glowing with pride. The other was carefully washing paintbrushes in a water bucket, his tongue poking out in concentration. "Julian, that's beautiful," Serena said, her voice carrying clearly across the playground. "You've really captured the way morning light looks on the water." "Louis is better at painting boats," Julian replied with the generous spirit of a child secure in his mother's love. "But I like painting the sky." Julian and Louis, His sons had names, personalities, 5 years of life he'd missed entirely. Wallace watched Louis abandon his brush-washing to wrap his arms around Serena's waist in a spontaneous hug and felt something break open in his chest. This was what he'd given up. Not just Serena, not just the abstract concept of children, but this, a Saturday morning in a small town, watching his sons discover art while their mother guided them with infinite patience. This was the life his arrogant words had cost him. "Mama, can we show Mrs. Martinez our paintings when we're done?" Louis asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. "Of course, sweetheart. She'll love to see what you've created." Wallace forced himself to move closer, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone in the playground must be able to hear it. He needed to see their faces clearly, needed to confirm what his heart already knew with absolute certainty. As he approached the art station, Julian looked up from his painting and their eyes met. Blue eyes identical to Wallace's own, set in a face that was unmistakably his child's face. The boy tilted his head with curious interest, studying this tall stranger with the unconscious intensity that Wallace recognized from his own childhood. "Hello," Julian said politely, the greeting of a well-mannered child meeting an adult. "Hello," Wallace managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Serena looked up at the sound of his voice, and the world stopped turning. 5 years collapsed into nothing. Every day of searching, every night of regret, every moment of wondering if he'd imagined the depth of what they'd shared. It all condensed into this single instant when their eyes met across a picnic table covered with children's artwork. The color drained from Serena's face, her hand instinctively moving to grip Julian's shoulder as if to protect him. Louis, oblivious to the tension suddenly crackling in the air, continued washing brushes and humming under his breath. Wallace. His name on her lips was barely a whisper, carrying 5 years of pain and surprise, and something that might have been longing before she shuttered her expression into careful neutrality. "I found you," he said, the words inadequate for the magnitude of this moment. Serena's gaze flicked to the boys, then back to his face, and he saw the exact moment she realized what he was seeing, what conclusions he was drawing from the evidence before him. "Boys," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "why don't you take your paintings over to Mrs. Martinez? Show her what you've been working on." "But Mama," Louis began. "Now please," Serena said, her tone gentle but firm in the way that brooked no argument. Julian, always the more perceptive twin, looked back and forth between his mother and Wallace, with eyes too wise for a 5-year-old. But he took Louis's hand and led him away, casting one last curious glance over his shoulder at the tall man who'd made his mama look scared. When they were out of earshot, Serena finally spoke. "How long have you been looking for me?" 5 years, Wallace said simply. "Every weekend, every town between here and California, I never stopped searching." "Why?" The question came out broken, desperate. "You got what you wanted, Wallace. A life without complications, a life without children." Wallace looked across the playground to where Julian was showing his painting to an elderly woman who must be Mrs. Martinez, while Louis chattered excitedly about his brush-washing technique. His sons, beautiful, perfect, 5 years old, and growing up without knowing their father existed. "Because I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with regret. "About everything. About children, about what mattered, about what I wanted my life to be. I've spent 5 years learning what it feels like to live without the people who matter most." "They don't know," Serena said suddenly, understanding flooding her voice. "They don't know you're their father." Wallace's throat closed with emotion. "What do they know?" "That their daddy works very far away and can't visit." Serena's voice was carefully neutral, but Wallace caught the tremor underneath. "I told them you love them, but your job keeps you traveling." Even in protecting herself, even in running from his rejection, she'd been kind. She'd given their sons a father who loved them from a distance, rather than one who hadn't wanted them at all. "Serena," Wallace began, but she was already shaking her head. "You can't just show up here and expect—" "Mama!" Louis came running back, his painting clutched in his small hands. "Mrs. Martinez said my boat looks like it could sail right off the paper, and she wants to know if we can help with the mural project next week." He skidded to a stop beside Serena, then looked up at Wallace with open curiosity. "Are you going to help with the mural too? It's going to have ocean waves and seagulls and everything?" Wallace knelt down to Louis's eye level, bringing himself face to face with his son for the first time. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. Not just the coloring, but the shape of his nose, the stubborn set of his chin, even the way he bounced slightly when excited. "That sounds like an amazing project," Wallace said, his voice gentle. "You must be a very good artist." "I am," Louis declared without false modesty. "Julian's better at some things, but I'm really good at painting water. Want to see?" Before Wallace could respond, Louis was showing him the painting, a child's interpretation of boats on blue water, complete with yellow sun and cotton ball clouds. It was the most beautiful thing Wallace had ever seen. "It's perfect," he said honestly. "You have real talent." Louis beamed, then suddenly stepped closer and wrapped his arms around Wallace's neck in the spontaneous way of children who hadn't yet learned to be cautious with their affection. The hug hit Wallace like a physical blow, this trusting embrace from the child he'd never known existed, the son who should have been in his life from the very beginning. He closed his eyes and held Louis carefully, breathing in the scent of paint and little boy shampoo and possibilities he'd thought he'd lost forever. When Louis pulled back, he studied Wallace's face with serious consideration. "You have pretty eyes," he announced. "They're the same color as mine and Julian's." The innocent observation hung in the air like a revelation, and Wallace saw Serena's face go pale as she realized their son had noticed what she'd spent 5 years hoping he wouldn't see. This was the moment everything changed. This was where his real life began. Chapter 3. The Confrontation. The cruelest truth about love is that it never dies. It just learns to live with the scars of what could have been. The cottage at 247 Maple Street looked like something from a fairy tale, with its white picket fence, climbing roses, and cheerful yellow shutters that spoke of a woman determined to create beauty despite heartbreak. Wallace sat in his silver Mercedes at the curb, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white, watching the home Serena had built without him. Through the kitchen window, he could see her moving with the same graceful efficiency he remembered, preparing what looked like lunch. Even from this distance, even after 5 years, the sight of her made his chest tighten with longing so fierce it threatened to break him. Then he heard them, childish laughter floating through the spring air like music. "Julian, don't chase Louis with that worm," Serena's voice carried from the backyard, warm with affection and mock exasperation. "And Louis, stop screaming like you're being murdered." Wallace followed the sound, walking along the picket fence until he could see into the garden behind the house. The sight that greeted him stopped him dead in his tracks. 2 identical little boys were racing around a vegetable garden, one clutching an earthworm, while the other shrieked with delighted terror. They were miniature versions of himself at that age, all long limbs and untamed energy, their dark hair catching the sunlight as they ran. But where Wallace had been serious, even as a child, focused and driven, Julian and Louis radiated pure joy. "I'm gonna put it in your pocket," Julian declared, chasing his brother around a tomato plant. "Mama, Julian's being mean," Louis called, but his laughter belied any real distress. "Boys," Serena emerged from behind a garden shed, wearing faded jeans and a paint-splattered t-shirt, looking more beautiful than Wallace had ever seen her. What have I told you about terrorizing each other with garden creatures? That it's only okay on Wednesdays? Julian suggested hopefully. That it builds character, Louis added, grinning. Serena laughed, a sound that had haunted Wallace's dreams for 5 years. Nice try, troublemakers. Now go wash your hands. Lunch is almost ready. Wallace watched, mesmerized, as she scooped both boys into her arms despite their protests about being too big to carry. She spun them around, all 3 of them dissolving into giggles, and in that moment Wallace saw everything he'd lost with crystal clarity. This was what love looked like. Not the sophisticated dinners and weekend getaways he'd shared with Serena 5 years ago, but this, muddy children and patient guidance and laughter that echoed off cottage walls. This was the family he'd rejected before it could even exist. The boys disappeared into the house, but Serena remained in the garden, kneeling beside a patch of herbs. Wallace watched her fingers gentle on the young plants, the same hands that had once traced patterns across his chest in the darkness of his penthouse. Now those hands tended a garden for children he'd never known, created a home that had no place for him. Before he could lose his courage, he pushed through the gate. The soft click of the latch made Serena look up, and the world stopped turning. 5 years collapsed into nothing. Every day of searching, every night of regret, every moment of wondering if he'd imagined the depth of what they'd shared, it all condensed into this single instant when their eyes met across a garden that smelled of growing things and second chances. Serena's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions. Shock, pain, anger, and something that might have been longing before she shuttered her expression into careful neutrality. Wallace. His name on her lips was barely a whisper. Hello, Serena. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees, buying time to compose herself. When she faced him fully, Wallace could see the changes 5 years had wrought. She was still breathtakingly beautiful, but there was a strength in her bearing that hadn't been there before, a quiet confidence that spoke of battles fought and won. What are you doing here? Her voice was steady, controlled, but Wallace caught the slight tremor underneath. I found you. The words came out rougher than he'd intended. After 5 years, I finally found you. I wasn't hiding. Weren't you? Wallace stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to catch her familiar scent beneath the garden soil and spring air. You disappeared without a word, Serena. One day you were in my life, and the next, you got exactly what you wanted. The anger broke through her composure like water through a dam. A life without complications, a life without children cluttering up your perfect existence. The accusation hit him like a physical blow, but Wallace forced himself to hold her gaze. I was wrong. You were honest. Serena's laugh was bitter, broken, brutally, devastatingly honest. And I'm grateful for that honesty, Wallace, because it saved my children from growing up with a father who would see them as burdens. My children. Not our children. The distinction carved another piece from his already shattered heart. They're mine too, he said quietly. Serena's composure cracked entirely. Don't you dare stand in my garden and claim them now. You made your choice 5 years ago. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. The words exploded from her with 5 years of suppressed pain. I tried to tell you, Wallace. That last night I asked you what would happen if children were already part of the equation, and you looked at me like I was suggesting we burn down your precious empire. You gave me an ultimatum, you or them. So I chose them. Wallace felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as the full weight of his failure crashed over him. She had tried to tell him, in her careful way, with the gentle approach he'd once found so endearing. She'd tried to share the most important news of their lives, and he'd shut her down before she could even begin. Serena, if you had known what? You would have done your duty, married me because you had to, raised children you resented because society expected it. She shook her head, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. I loved you too much to trap you in a life you didn't want. I loved our babies too much to subject them to a father who would always see them as mistakes. They're not mistakes. The words came from somewhere deep in his soul, a truth he'd only recently discovered. They're miracles. They're beautiful and perfect and you've been watching us. Her voice went cold with realization. You've been having us watched, photographed, studied like specimens. Wallace's silence was answer enough. Get out. The words were quiet, deadly. Get out of my garden, get out of my town, and get out of our lives. Serena, please. Mama? A small voice interrupted from the kitchen doorway. Julian stood there, his dark hair tousled, his blue eyes, Wallace's eyes, wide with curiosity. Who's the man? Wallace's breath caught in his throat. This was his son. This beautiful, serious little boy was his child, and he was looking at his father like a stranger, because that's what Wallace was, a stranger who had forfeited his right to be anything more. Just someone who was leaving, Serena said, but her voice was gentler now, careful not to frighten Julian. But Louis had appeared beside his brother, and where Julian was cautious, Louis was bold. He walked right up to Wallace with the fearless curiosity of a 5-year-old, tilting his head in that achingly familiar gesture. You're really tall, Louis observed. Are you a giant? Despite everything, Wallace felt his lips twitch with the ghost of a smile. No, I'm not a giant. Louis, come here, Serena called, but Louis was already reaching up to touch Wallace's hand. The contact was electric. This tiny hand in his, so trusting, so warm, so absolutely perfect. Wallace looked down at his son, and felt his careful control finally shatter. You have pretty eyes, Louis said solemnly. They're like mine and Julian's. Louis, Serena's voice was sharp with panic. Come away from there right now. But Julian had joined his brother, studying Wallace with an intensity that was pure Serena. Mama, why are you crying? Wallace looked up to see tears streaming down Serena's face, and he knew that his own eyes were bright with unshed emotion. Standing there in her garden with both boys reaching for him, Julian with cautious interest, Louis with open affection, Wallace understood the true magnitude of what he'd lost. These weren't just children. They were his children. They were 5 years of bedtime stories he'd never read, 5 years of scraped knees he'd never kissed better, 5 years of "I love you, Daddy" that would never be spoken. They were birthday parties and Christmas mornings and first days of school that had happened without him. They were everything he'd been too afraid to want until it was too late. Serena, he said, his voice breaking on her name. I know I have no right to ask this. I know I gave up any claim to your forgiveness when I spoke those words 5 years ago, but please, let me try to make this right. Let me try to be the man they deserve, the father they need. It's too late for that. But even as she said it, Serena was watching Julian lean against Wallace's leg while Louis examined the expensive watch on his wrist. They don't need a father who shows up when it's convenient and disappears when it gets difficult. I won't disappear again. The promise came from the depths of his soul. I've spent 5 years learning what life feels like without you, without them. I won't make that mistake twice. Mama, Julian looked up at his mother with those impossibly wise eyes. Is this our daddy? The question hung in the air like a prayer, innocent and devastating in its simplicity. Wallace held his breath, waiting for Serena's answer, knowing that whatever she said would determine the course of all their lives. Serena looked at Wallace, really looked at him, and for a moment he saw past her anger to the pain underneath. The loneliness of 5 years raising twins alone, the exhaustion of being the only parent to weather tantrums and celebrate achievements, the heartbreak of watching her sons wonder why they were different from other families. Yes, she whispered finally, the word barely audible. "This is your daddy." And in that moment, Wallace Galbraith, master of the universe, builder of empires, man who had everything money could buy, fell to his knees in a stranger's garden and wept for everything he'd almost lost forever. Chapter 4. Little Hearts, Big Questions. Children see the world with hearts wide open, asking the questions adults are too afraid to answer. The cottage living room felt smaller with Wallace's presence filling it. His expensive suit and careful posture, a stark contrast to the comfortable chaos of crayon drawings on the walls, toy trucks scattered across the rug, and picture books stacked on every surface. Julian and Louis had insisted he come inside after Serena's earth-shattering revelation, their small hands tugging at his jacket with the innocent persistence that only children possessed. "Daddy, do you want to see my dinosaur collection?" Louis bounced on his toes, his earlier shyness evaporating in the face of having a real, live father to impress. "I have a T-Rex and a Triceratops and a... What's the long-neck one called, Julian?" "Brontosaurus," Julian supplied, though his dark eyes never left Wallace's face, studying him with an intensity that made Wallace's chest tighten. This son was the observer, the one who noticed everything and processed it carefully before acting. "That's a very impressive collection," Wallace managed, his voice rough with emotion. He sat carefully on the edge of Serena's worn but comfortable sofa, trying to make himself seem less intimidating to these small beings who shared his DNA but knew nothing of his life. Serena stood in the doorway like a sentinel, her arms crossed, watching every interaction with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who'd spent 5 years being the only barrier between her children and the world's potential hurts. Wallace could feel her tension from across the room, could see the war playing out across her features, the desire to protect her sons battling with the knowledge that they needed their father, even if that father had once rejected them. "Are you really our daddy?" Louis climbed onto the sofa beside Wallace with the casual intimacy of a child who'd never learned to fear strangers. "Mama, show him the pictures." "Louis," Serena began, but Julian was already dragging a photo album from the bottom shelf of the bookcase. "These are all the pictures of us growing up," Julian explained with serious 5-year-old gravity, climbing onto Wallace's other side and opening the album across his lap. "Mama takes lots of pictures because she says memories are important." Wallace's throat closed as he looked down at the first page. Serena in a hospital bed, exhausted but radiant, holding 2 impossibly tiny babies. The timestamp read October 15th, their birthday, his son's birthday, a day that had passed unmarked in his life for 5 years while somewhere Serena had been celebrating alone. "That's me," Louis pointed to one swaddled bundle. "I was born first, so I'm the big brother, but Julian's bigger now 'cause he eats more vegetables." "I'm not bigger," Julian protested mildly. "We're exactly the same size. Mama measured us last week." Wallace turned the page with trembling hands. More photos. The boys at 6 months, sitting up and reaching for the camera. At 1 year, taking their first wobbly steps in what looked like a small apartment. At 2, covered in birthday cake and grinning identical chocolate-smeared smiles. Where was I? The question escaped before Wallace could stop it, raw and broken. Julian tilted his head, considering. "Mama says you were working very far away and couldn't come visit." "But you're here now," Louis added pragmatically, snuggling closer to Wallace's side with the easy affection of a child who'd never learned that adults could be dangerous. "So maybe you're done working far away?" Wallace looked across the room at Serena, who had gone very still in the doorway. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw the story she'd told their sons, not the truth of his rejection, but a gentler fiction that protected their young hearts from the knowledge that their father hadn't wanted them. "Yes," Wallace said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm done working far away." "Good," Louis declared with 5-year-old certainty. "We missed you even though we didn't know you yet. That's weird, right, Julian?" Julian nodded solemnly. "Sometimes I would dream about having a daddy, and he looked just like you. Mama said that was my imagination, but maybe it was magic." The innocence of it, their complete acceptance, their immediate affection, their willingness to love him despite his absence, broke something open in Wallace's chest. These beautiful children, his children, had been dreaming of him while he'd been too stubborn and afraid to even acknowledge their existence. "Can you stay for lunch?" Louis asked, already assuming the answer would be yes. "Mama makes the best grilled cheese in the whole world. She cuts them into triangles and everything." "I don't know if—" Wallace began, looking towards Serena for permission. "Please, Mama." Julian's quiet voice carried more weight than his brother's enthusiasm. "We've never had lunch with a daddy before." The simple statement hit all three adults like a physical blow. Serena's hand flew to her throat, her carefully maintained composure cracking. Wallace felt the familiar burn of shame and regret, while Julian and Louis waited with the patience of children accustomed to adult conversations they couldn't quite understand. "I suppose—" Serena's voice was barely audible. "I suppose we have enough sandwiches." The boys cheered, Louis actually bouncing on the sofa cushions, while Julian smiled, a smaller, more contained version of his brother's joy, but no less genuine. "I'll help Mama in the kitchen," Julian announced, sliding off the sofa. "You stay here with Louis, Daddy. He'll show you all his drawings." Daddy. The word hit Wallace like lightning every time one of his sons said it. He'd never imagined how it would feel to be called that, had never wanted to know. Now it seemed like the most beautiful sound in the world. "I drew this one yesterday," Louis was saying, pulling a sheet of construction paper from a stack on the coffee table. "It's our family." Wallace studied the crayon drawing with the seriousness it deserved. 3 stick figures stood in front of a house with a crooked chimney, a tall woman with long dark hair, and 2 smaller figures with matching grins. But there was a 4th figure, set apart from the others, sketched in lighter strokes as if the artist wasn't sure whether it belonged. "Who's this?" Wallace asked, pointing to the separate figure. "That's our daddy," Louis explained matter-of-factly. "I always draw him, but I never knew what he looked like, so I had to guess. But I got it right. You're tall, and you have dark hair, and you look kind." Wallace's vision blurred. This child, his child, had been including him in family portraits for years, holding space for a father he'd never met, somehow knowing that somewhere out there, someone belonged with them. "You did get it right," Wallace managed. "You're a very good artist." "Julian's better. He draws dinosaurs that look real. I'll show you." Louis scrambled off the sofa and rummaged through a box of artwork, chattering constantly. "This is Julian's T-Rex. See how he made the teeth all pointy? And this is his Stegosaurus." He looked it up in a book to make sure he got the spikes right. Julian's really smart. He knows all the dinosaur names and he can read chapter books and everything. Each detail was a gift and a torture. 5 years of his sons' lives, their personalities and preferences and talents, delivered in an endless stream by a child desperate to share everything with his newly discovered father. "What about you?" Wallace asked. "What do you like besides dinosaurs and drawing?" "I like butterflies," Louis said without embarrassment, "and flowers, and I'm really good at hugging. Mama says I give the best hugs in the universe. Want to see?" Before Wallace could respond, Louis launched himself into his arms with complete trust, small arms wrapping around Wallace's neck with fierce affection. The embrace was warm and sweet and utterly perfect, smelling of apple juice and boy shampoo and innocence. "Louis gives the best hugs," Julian confirmed from the kitchen doorway, where he'd appeared carrying a plate of carefully arranged sandwich triangles. "But I'm better at reading bedtime stories. I do all the voices different. I would love to hear you read a story." Wallace said, still holding Louis, still marveling at how natural it felt to have his son in his arms. Really? Julian's eyes lit up. I could read you Where the Wild Things Are. It's my favorite. Mine too, Louis added, especially when Julian makes Max sound all growly. They ate lunch at the small kitchen table, Wallace's expensive suit looking absurdly out of place between two booster seats. The boys chattered non-stop, telling him about their school, their friends, their teacher, Miss Valencia, who let them plant seeds in the classroom and take turns feeding the class goldfish. Serena remained quiet throughout the meal, but Wallace caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was pain there, and wariness, but also something that might have been wonder as she observed him with their sons. "Daddy," Louis said around a bite of sandwich, "do you have to go back to working far away?" The question made Serena go very still, her sandwich forgotten halfway to her mouth. "I don't know," Wallace answered honestly. "That depends on a lot of things." "Like what?" Julian asked with his characteristic directness. Wallace looked at Serena, then back at his sons, these perfect little people who'd accepted him so completely, so quickly, despite his years of absence. "Like whether your mama thinks it's okay for me to stay nearby, whether you want me to be part of your lives, whether I can learn how to be a good daddy." "You're already a good daddy," Louis declared with absolute certainty. "You listened to all my stories, and you didn't say my hug was too tight and you like my drawings. And you have kind eyes," Julian added quietly. "Mama always says you can tell if someone's good by looking at their eyes." Wallace's gaze found Serena's across the table. Her own eyes were bright with unshed tears, and he wondered what she saw when she looked at him now. The man who'd rejected their children, or the man who was struggling to prove himself worthy of their love? "Can we show Daddy our room?" Louis asked, bouncing in his chair. "We have bunk beds and everything." "After you finish your lunch," Serena said, finding her voice at last. "Both of you." The boys applied themselves to their sandwiches with renewed focus, and Wallace found himself memorizing every detail. The way Julian ate his crusts first, the way Louis hummed under his breath while he chewed, the comfortable silence that spoke of a family ritual performed countless times. This was what he'd given up. Not just Serena, not just the abstract concept of children, but this, ordinary moments made extraordinary by love, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with people who belonged to you completely. "Daddy?" Julian's voice was smaller now, uncertain. "Are you going to disappear again?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Wallace looked at this serious little boy, his son, who'd learned too young that adults could leave without warning, could vanish from lives and leave only empty spaces behind. "I don't want to," Wallace said carefully. "I never wanted to disappear the first time. I just didn't know you existed." "But you know now," Louis pointed out with flawless 5-year-old logic. "Yes," Wallace agreed. "I know now." "Then you'll stay?" Julian pressed, needing certainty in a way that broke Wallace's heart. Wallace looked at Serena, who was watching this exchange with an expression of such vulnerability it made his chest ache. She'd spent 5 years being everything to these boys. Mother and father, protector and provider, the constant in their ever-changing world. Now she was being asked to trust the man who'd once rejected them, to believe that he'd changed enough to be worthy of their love. "I'll stay as long as your mama says it's okay," Wallace said finally, "and as long as you want me here." "We want you here forever," Louis announced immediately. Julian was more cautious, as always. "What if you change your mind? What if you decide you don't want to be our daddy anymore?" The question was like a knife to Wallace's heart. This child, his child, was already protecting himself against abandonment, already learning that love could be conditional, temporary. "Julian," Wallace said, reaching across the table to touch his son's small hand, I can't change your mind about a lot of things, but I will never, ever change my mind about wanting to be your daddy. You and Louis are the most important things in the world to me." "More important than work?" Julian asked skeptically. "More important than anything," Wallace confirmed, and meant it with every fibre of his being. The smile that spread across Julian's face was like sunrise, slow and brilliant and full of hope. Louis cheered and launched himself at Wallace again, sticky sandwich fingers and all, while across the table Serena wiped away tears she could no longer hide. In that small kitchen, surrounded by the chaos and joy of family life, Wallace finally understood what he'd been searching for all these years. Not success or wealth or power, but this, the simple miracle of being loved unconditionally by people who belonged to you completely. He'd found his sons. Now he had to find a way to deserve them. Chapter 5. The Slow Dance of Hearts. Love isn't rebuilt in grand gestures. It's reconstructed one careful brick at a time, with patience as mortar and hope as foundation. 3 weeks had passed since Wallace first walked into Serena's garden, and the rhythm of their new reality was still fragile, uncertain, like a song being learned by musicians who'd forgotten how to play together. Every morning, Wallace drove the 3 hours from Seattle to Willowbrook, arriving as the boys finished breakfast, and Serena prepared for her day at the elementary school, where she taught art to children who adored her almost as much as Julian and Louis did. The cottage had become a second home to him, though he was careful never to assume his welcome, never to push beyond the boundaries Serena had carefully established. He slept in Willowbrook's only hotel, a charming bed and breakfast run by Phoenix Whitmore, Serena's closest friend and fiercest protector. Phoenix had made her opinion of Wallace crystal clear during their first encounter. "You hurt her once," Phoenix had said, cornering him in the hotel lobby with the directness that had apparently made her Serena's perfect friend. "These aren't just words to me. I held her while she cried herself to sleep, watched her work 2 jobs while pregnant with twins, saw her pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. You get one chance to prove you've changed. One." Wallace had accepted the warning with the gravity it deserved, understanding that Phoenix's loyalty to Serena was absolute and non-negotiable. In another life, he might have been offended by such bluntness from a stranger. Now, he was grateful that Serena had someone who loved her enough to be suspicious of his motives. This morning was different, though. For the first time, Serena had asked him to stay while she went to work, trusting him alone with Julian and Louis during their teacher planning day. It was a small gesture of faith, but to Wallace it felt monumental. "Daddy, can we show you the secret fort?" Louis bounced on his toes beside the kitchen table where Wallace was helping Julian work through a picture book about ocean creatures. "It's in the woods behind our house, and it's super secret and hidden and everything." "It's not that secret," Julian corrected with his characteristic precision. "Mama knows about it, and Mrs. Chen from next door saw us building it last week." "But it's secret from most people," Louis insisted. "And Daddy's not most people. He's our daddy." The casual way they'd begun, including him in their world, still took Wallace's breath away. 3 weeks, and these beautiful children had simply absorbed him into their lives, as if he'd always been there. They saved their best drawings for him, insisted on showing him every book and toy and hiding place that mattered to them, asked his opinion on everything from what shoes to wear to whether clouds were made of cotton balls. "I would love to see your fort," Wallace said, closing the book and giving Julian his full attention. "But only if you're sure it's okay to share the secret with me." "It's okay," Julian said solemnly. "You're family now." Family. The word hit Wallace like it did every time. Unexpected, overwhelming, precious beyond measure. He was family to these boys, despite 5 years of absence, despite the circumstances that had kept him from knowing they existed. They'd claimed him with the wholehearted acceptance that only children possessed. "Then lead the way," Wallace said, standing and offering a hand to each boy. The fort turned out to be an elaborate construction of fallen branches, old sheets, and 5-year-old imagination tucked into a grove of pine trees that provided natural shelter. Wallace had to crawl to get inside, but once he was settled on the blanket that served as flooring, he understood the appeal. It was cozy and private, a place where small boys could be kings of their own domain. "Julian designed it," Lewis explained proudly. "He's really good at building things. I mostly just carried sticks." "I couldn't have built it without your help," Julian said, with the generosity that seemed to define his relationship with his twin. "And you found the perfect sheets in Mama's donation box." Wallace listened to them describe the fort's construction, the problems they'd solved, the improvements they planned to make, and felt something shift inside his chest. These weren't just his children. They were remarkable little people, kind and creative, and full of the wonder that adults too often lost along the way. "We could build a bigger fort," Louis suggested suddenly. "One that's tall enough for daddies to stand up in." "Would you help us, Daddy?" "I would love to help you build anything you want," Wallace said, meaning it completely. "Really?" Julian's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm he usually kept carefully contained. "You know how to build things?" "I used to build things with my hands before I built them with money," Wallace admitted. "My father taught me carpentry when I was about your age. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed it." "What's carpentry?" Louis asked. "Working with wood, making things like tables and chairs and—" "Forts?" Julian interrupted hopefully. "Definitely forts," Wallace confirmed, grinning at their excitement. They spent the morning in the woods, Wallace teaching them to identify different types of trees, showing them how to test branches for strength, listening to their elaborate plans for fort improvements. By lunchtime, all 3 of them were covered in pine sap and dirt, but Wallace couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so genuinely happy. "We should probably get cleaned up before your mama gets home," he said, as they emerged from the trees. "She might not appreciate having 3 forest creatures in her kitchen." "Mama likes it when we get dirty," Louis informed him. "She says it means we're having adventures." "But she also likes it when we wash our hands before lunch," Julian added pragmatically. They trooped inside, Wallace helping both boys scrub pine sap from their fingers while they chattered about their morning. The domestic normalcy of it, helping children wash up, listening to their stories, being needed in the small, immediate ways that made up daily life, felt both foreign and natural to Wallace. "Are you hungry?" he asked, surveying Serena's well-organized kitchen. She'd left sandwich materials and a note with instructions, but the boys were already climbing onto their chairs at the table, clearly expecting him to know what to do. "Mama cuts our sandwiches into triangles," Louis offered helpfully, "and she gives us apples and cheese sticks and juice boxes." "I can handle triangles," Wallace said, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. But as he worked, he found himself studying the details of Serena's life that surrounded him. The grocery list held to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a butterfly, the boys' artwork covering every available surface, the coffee mug in the sink that still held traces of her morning routine. This was the life she'd built without him, practical and beautiful, full of love and laughter and the 1,000 small choices that created a home. She'd taken his rejection and transformed it into strength, created a world where Julian and Louis could grow up feeling secure and valued and cherished. "Daddy?" Julian's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "Why didn't you come see us when we were babies?" The question Wallace had been dreading, delivered with the innocent directness that made it impossible to deflect. "Because I didn't know about you," Wallace said carefully, settling sandwiches in front of both boys. "Your mama and we had a disagreement and she moved away before she could tell me she was having babies." "What kind of disagreement?" Louis asked around a bite of sandwich. Wallace looked at these trusting faces, these children who'd welcomed him so completely and struggled with how much truth to share. They deserved honesty, but they also deserved to keep their innocence a little longer. "I said some things that hurt your mama's feelings," he said finally. "Things I didn't mean, but that made her think I wouldn't be a good daddy to you." "But you are a good daddy," Julian insisted with fierce loyalty. "I'm trying to be," Wallace said. "Every day I'm trying to be the kind of daddy you deserve." "You already are," Lewis declared with 5-year-old certainty. "You listen to our stories and you help us build forts and you cut our sandwiches right and everything." The simple acceptance in their voices made Wallace's throat tight with emotion. These children, his children, were offering him forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved, love he was still learning how to earn. "Can I ask you guys something?" Wallace said, settling into his own chair. Both boys nodded, suddenly serious. "Are you happy with your mama, with your life here? Is there anything you wish was different?" Julian and Lewis exchanged one of their twin looks, some wordless communication passing between them. "We're really happy," Julian said carefully. "Mama takes good care of us, and we have friends at school, and Phoenix makes the best cookies in the world. But sometimes we wished we had a daddy," Louis added softly. "Not because Mama isn't enough, but because other kids have daddies and we wondered what it would be like." "And now we know," Julian smiled, that slow, brilliant expression that transformed his serious little face. "It's really nice." Wallace had to look away for a moment, overwhelmed by the simple generosity of these children who'd welcomed him into their lives without reservation. The reservation was made without conditions, without the wariness he probably deserved. When Serena arrived home that afternoon, she found all 3 of them in the backyard, covered in sawdust, and working on what appeared to be the frame for a proper fort. Wallace was kneeling beside Julian, showing him how to hold a hammer safely, while Louis arranged nails in careful rows, his tongue poking out in concentration. "What's all this?" she asked, though her tone was more amused than alarmed. "We're building a real fort," Louis announced, abandoning his nails to run to her. "Daddy knows how to make things with wood, and he's teaching us, and it's going to be the best fort in the whole world." "It's going to have walls you can't see through," Julian added, looking up from his hammering, "and a roof that doesn't leak when it rains. Daddy showed us how to measure everything so it fits together perfectly." Serena's eyes met Wallace's over the boys' heads, and something passed between them. A recognition of how natural this looked, how right it felt, despite everything that had come before. "Well," she said, setting down her teacher's bag and rolling up her sleeves, "it looks like you could use another pair of hands. What can I do to help?" And there, in the late afternoon sunshine, with Julian and Lewis chattering excitedly about their construction project, Wallace felt the first stirring of something he'd thought was lost forever. Not just the possibility of forgiveness, but the hope of building something new together, something stronger than what they'd had before, built on the foundation of these perfect children who'd taught them both what love really meant. Chapter 6. Walls Begin to Crumble. The heart remembers what the mind tries to forget, and love finds its way back through the smallest cracks in our armor. The evening air was soft with the promise of summer, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass through Serena's garden. 2 months had passed since Wallace first appeared at her gate, and the careful boundaries she'd constructed around her heart were beginning to feel less like protection and more like prison walls. She sat on the back porch steps, watching Wallace and the boys put the finishing touches on their fort, a proper structure now, with walls and a peaked roof and windows cut at perfect 5-year-old height. The sound of their laughter drifted through the twilight, punctuated by Julian's serious questions about joint construction and Louis's enthusiastic commentary on everything from the color of the wood stain to the possibility of installing electricity. "Mama, look!" Louis called, poking his head out of one of the windows. "We can see all the way to Mrs. Chen's garden from up here." "It's perfect, sweetheart," Serena called back, her voice catching slightly on the endearment. Because it was perfect, not just the fort, but this whole scene. Wallace on his knees beside Julian, patiently teaching him to sand rough edges smooth. Louis dancing around them both, chattering non-stop about their next project. The golden light of evening turning them all into something from a storybook. A family that looked so natural together it made her chest ache. This was what she'd dreamed of during those long nights of pregnancy, when she'd imagined the father her children would never know. This gentle patience, this easy laughter, this way of making Julian and Louis feel like the most important people in the world. Wallace had become everything she'd once hoped he could be, and it terrified her. "All done," Wallace announced, standing and brushing sawdust from his jeans. Over the past 2 months, his wardrobe had gradually shifted from expensive suits to casual clothes that could withstand fort building and garden work and the general chaos that came with loving 5-year-old boys. Tonight, he wore faded denim and a soft grey t-shirt that clung to shoulders that had grown broader with the physical work he'd been doing around her property. "Can we sleep in it tonight?" Julian asked hopefully. "Just for a little while?" "It's a school night," Serena reminded them gently. "But maybe this weekend we can have a camp-out." "With Daddy?" Louis asked, as he did about everything now. Their father had become the center of their world with a speed that both amazed and worried Serena. What would happen when the novelty wore off? When Wallace remembered that he had a business empire to run, a life in Seattle that didn't include bedtime stories and scraped knees and the endless, exhausting, wonderful demands of parenthood. "If Daddy wants to," she said carefully, the same response she gave to all such questions. "I would love to," Wallace said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her look away. "I can't think of anything I'd rather do." "Time to wash up for dinner," Serena announced, standing and brushing off her skirt. "Both of you, and I mean really wash, with soap and everything." The boys groaned but obeyed, racing each other to the outdoor spigot Wallace had installed last week when he'd noticed them getting muddy hands from garden work. Another small improvement, another way he'd woven himself into the fabric of their daily lives without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. "They're amazing," Wallace said quietly, coming to stand beside her as they watched Julian and Louis splash each other while attempting to follow washing instructions. "Sometimes I watch them and I can't believe I almost missed all of this." "You didn't miss it," Serena said, surprised by her own words. "You're here now. That's what matters to them." Wallace was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on their sons. "Is it what matters to you?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Serena felt the familiar flutter of panic in her chest, the fear that had kept her awake for weeks as she watched Wallace become everything she'd never dared hope he could be. "I should start dinner," she said instead of answering, moving toward the kitchen door. But Wallace's hand on her arm stopped her, gentle but insistent. "Serena, please. We can't keep pretending there isn't something happening between us." She turned to face him, and the breath caught in her throat at his nearness. 2 months of careful distance had done nothing to diminish the magnetic pull between them. If anything, watching him with Julian and Louis had only intensified the attraction, adding layers of respect and admiration to the desire that had never really faded. "What's happening between us is our children," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "That's all." "Is it?" Wallace stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes, could catch the scent of sawdust and soap and something indefinably him. "Because when I watch you laugh at something Louis says, or when you help Julian with his reading, or when you hum while you're cooking dinner, I remember why I fell in love with you 5 years ago, and I hope, that maybe you remember too." Serena's carefully constructed walls began to tremble. "Wallace, I know I have no right to ask for anything beyond the boys," he continued, his voice dropping to that intimate tone she remembered from their nights together, when the world had been just the two of them, and everything had seemed possible. "I know I destroyed what we had when I was too stupid and scared to see what you were offering me, but Serena, these past 2 months, watching you with our sons, seeing the life you've built, the woman you've become, I've fallen in love with you all over again." The words hit her like a physical force, breaking through defenses she'd spent 5 years building. "You don't love me," she whispered. "You love the idea of a family, the picture we make together. But this isn't sustainable, Wallace. You have a life in Seattle, a business that needs you." "I sold it." The simple statement stopped her cold. "What?" "I sold the business. Last week. Sterling's been wanting to buy me out for years, and I finally said yes." Wallace's hands came up to frame her face, his touch achingly familiar. "I'm not going anywhere, Serena. I'm not the man who put work before everything else. I can't be that man anymore, not when I know what I'd be giving up." "You sold your business?" She could barely process the words. Wallace's company had been his life, his identity, the thing he'd claimed children would destroy. "But that was everything to you." "No," he said softly, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "You were everything to me. You and Julian and Lewis. I was just too much of a fool to realize it until I'd lost you." Tears spilled over despite her efforts to contain them. "You can't just reorganize your whole life around us. What if this doesn't work? What if it does?" Wallace interrupted gently. "What if we could have what we should have had 5 years ago? What if our sons could grow up in a house where their parents love each other, where they don't have to wonder why Daddy lives somewhere else?" The dream he was painting was everything she'd wanted and been afraid to hope for. But the fear was still there, sharp and persistent. "I can't risk their hearts again," she whispered. "They love you so much already. If you change your mind, if you decide this isn't what you want, then you'll hate me, and rightfully so," Wallace said. "But Serena, I won't change my mind. I can't. Do you know what I think about when I wake up in that hotel room every morning? Whether Julian remembered to brush his teeth, whether Louis had any bad dreams, whether you got enough sleep, or if you were up worrying about money, or the boys, or any of the 1,000 things you handle alone every day. I think about how much I want to be here, in this house, helping with breakfast and homework and bedtime stories. I think about how much I want to hold you again, to wake up beside you, to build the life we should have had from the beginning." His words were breaking her apart, dismantling every careful defense she'd constructed. "Wallace, I love you," he said simply. "I love the woman you were 5 years ago, and I love the woman you've become. I love watching you with our sons, seeing how patient and wise and strong you are. I love that you sing while you cook, and that you leave little notes in the boys' lunch boxes, and that you turned a broken heart into a beautiful life for our children. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of loving you back." The words hung between them in the gathering darkness, weighted with promise and possibility. Serena felt the last of her walls crumbling, the fear finally overcome by the hope she'd been trying so hard to suppress. "Mama? Daddy?" Julian's voice drifted from the kitchen doorway. "Are you okay? You look like you're crying." Serena laughed through her tears, wiping her face as both boys approached with the concern that children showed when the adults in their world seemed upset. "I'm okay, sweetheart," she assured Julian, kneeling to his level. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're happy too." "Are you happy?" Louis asked, studying her face with his characteristic intensity. Serena looked at Wallace, at this man who'd somehow become everything she'd never dared dream he could be. Then at her sons, their sons, who were watching this exchange with the innocent hope that children brought to everything. "Yes," she said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "I'm very happy." "Good," Louis declared, wrapping his arms around her neck in one of his famous hugs. We want you to be happy, Mama. You and Daddy both. Are we going to be a real family now? Julian asked with his usual directness. Like Tommy at school, where the Mama and Daddy live in the same house? Wallace's eyes met Serena's over the boys' heads, the question hanging between them with all its implications and possibilities. Would you like that? Serena asked softly. More than anything, Julian said seriously. We love Daddy, and we love you, and it would be perfect if we could all be together all the time. All the time? Wallace asked, pretending to consider this seriously. Even when I snore? You snore? Lewis giggled. That's okay. Julian snores too, and I still love him. I do not snore, Julian protested with dignity. You do too. You sound like a baby bear. As the boys dissolved into giggles, debating the relative volume of Julian's nighttime breathing, Serena felt something settle in her chest, a peace she hadn't experienced in 5 years. Looking at Wallace, at the love and hope and determination in his eyes, she finally understood that some risks were worth taking. Yes, she said quietly, the word carrying the weight of forgiveness and trust, and a future she was finally brave enough to claim. Wallace's smile was radiant, transforming his face with joy. Yes, yes to all of it. To trying again, to building something new together, to giving our sons the family they deserve. She paused, taking a shaky breath. To loving you again, even though it terrifies me. It terrifies me too, Wallace admitted, pulling her close with Julian and Louis still giggling between them. But some things are worth being terrified for. And there, in her garden, surrounded by the laughter of their children and the promise of tomorrow, Serena finally let herself believe that sometimes love really could be enough. Chapter 7. The Kiss That Changed Everything. Some kisses are stolen in shadows, others are offered in moonlight, carrying the weight of every tomorrow on their breath. The boys had been asleep for an hour, tucked into their beds with extra stories and lingering goodnight kisses that came with having both parents home. Wallace had read Where the Wild Things Are with all the voices Julian loved, while Louis had claimed Serena's lap for his favorite butterfly lullaby. Now the cottage was wrapped in peaceful quiet, and Serena found herself alone with Wallace in her garden, the space between them crackling with possibility and 5 years of unspoken longing. I should probably head back to the hotel, Wallace said, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he remained on the porch swing beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, could catch his scent mixed with sawdust and the lavender soap the boys had insisted he use. Probably, Serena agreed, but her voice lacked conviction. The word yes she'd spoken earlier hung between them like a bridge, and she wasn't ready for him to cross back to his separate world. The garden around them was alive with summer sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, distant waves against the shore. Moonlight painted everything in silver, transforming the familiar into something magical. Serena, Wallace said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, about what you said earlier. I meant it. The words came out stronger than she'd expected. All of it. I'm tired of being afraid, Wallace. Tired of protecting myself from something I want so desperately it keeps me awake at night. Wallace turned to face her fully, his blue eyes dark in the moonlight. What do you want? I want to stop pretending that seeing you with Julian and Louis doesn't make my heart race, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to stop lying to myself about why I look forward to your visits, why I find excuses to brush against you when we're cooking together, why I dream about what it would feel like to have you hold me again. Wallace's breath caught, and she saw her own longing reflected in his eyes. I want to stop being afraid that you'll leave, she continued. I want to believe that the man who builds forts with our sons and fixes my broken porch steps is the man who'll still be here when things get difficult. Serena. I want our children to grow up in a house full of love, she said, the words tumbling out. I want them to see their parents kiss good morning and hold hands and dance in the kitchen. I want them to know that love is real and lasting and worth fighting for." Wallace's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture so familiar it made her chest ache. "What else do you want?" The question was intimate, loaded with possibility, and Serena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I want you to kiss me," she whispered. "I want to remember what it feels like to be more than just Julian and Louis's mother. I want to be your woman again." The words hung in the air between them, bold and vulnerable and terrifying in their honesty. For a moment, Wallace just stared at her, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. Then he was moving, his free hand coming up to cup her face with infinite gentleness. "Are you sure?" he asked, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "Because if I kiss you, Serena, I won't want to stop. I won't want to go back to my hotel room and pretend we're just co-parents. I'll want everything, you, them, the life we should have had." "Then don't stop," she breathed, leaning into his touch. "Don't go back. Don't pretend anymore." Wallace's control snapped with an almost audible sound. His mouth found hers with 5 years of pent-up longing, and Serena melted into him with a soft moan of surrender. The kiss was everything she remembered and more, tender and desperate, familiar and new, carrying the weight of their shared history and the promise of their future. "God, I've missed you," Wallace murmured against her mouth, his arms coming around her to pull her against him. "Every day for 5 years I've missed you." "I've missed you too," she admitted, the confession torn from somewhere deep in her soul. "Even when I hated you, even when I told myself I was better off without you, I missed you." He kissed her again, deeper this time, his tongue tracing the seam of her lips until she opened for him with a sigh of pure need. The taste of him was achingly familiar. Coffee and mint and something indefinably Wallace that had haunted her dreams. "I love you," he whispered against her throat, his lips trailing fire along her pulse point. "I love you so much it scares me. These past 2 months, watching you with our boys, seeing the incredible woman you've become, I fall more in love with you every day." But even as passion threatened to overwhelm them, a small sound from inside the house made them both freeze. Julian's voice, calling for water, thin with the confusion of a child caught between sleep and waking. They broke apart, breathing hard, and the spell of the moment shattered into the reality of their responsibilities. Serena touched her swollen lips, already missing the warmth of Wallace's mouth. "I should," she began. "Go," Wallace said, his voice rough. "He needs you." Serena stood on unsteady legs, but Wallace's hand caught hers before she could move away. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes burning with promise. "When you're ready, when the time is right, we'll finish this conversation." "What if I'm never ready?" The question escaped before she could stop it, her old fears rising despite the passion still thrumming through her veins. "What if I can't get past the fear that this is all temporary?" Wallace stood as well, pulling her close one more time, his forehead resting against hers. "Then we'll take it one day at a time, one kiss at a time, one moment at a time, until you believe what I know in my heart, that I'm never leaving you again." "Mama!" Julian's voice was stronger now, more insistent. "I'm coming, sweetheart," Serena called, then looked back at Wallace. "Stay," she said impulsively. "Don't go back to the hotel tonight. Sleep on the couch or in the guest room or just stay. I don't want you to leave." Wallace's smile was radiant. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure I don't want to wake up tomorrow wondering if I dreamed this whole conversation," she said honestly. "I'm sure I want our boys to come downstairs and find their daddy making pancakes. I'm sure I want to fall asleep knowing you're close by." "Then I'll stay," Wallace said simply, "for as long as you'll have me." Serena kissed him one more time, quick and sweet, then hurried inside to tend to Julian. Behind her, She heard Wallace settling onto the porch swing, and something tight in her chest loosened at the knowledge that he would be there when she came back downstairs. Julian needed only a drink of water and gentle reassurances before settling back into sleep. But by the time Serena returned to the garden, the spell of their earlier intimacy had shifted into something deeper, more sustainable. Wallace had brought pillows and a blanket from the linen closet, transforming the porch swing into a cozy nest. "I thought we could talk," he said, opening his arms in invitation. "Really talk, about everything we need to figure out." Serena curled against his side, her head finding its natural place on his shoulder, and felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years settle over her. "What do we need to figure out?" "Practical things," Wallace said, his hand stroking through her hair. "Where we'll live, how to blend our lives, how to help the boys adjust, whether you want more children someday, whether we should get married before or after we've figured out how to be a family again." "You want to marry me?" Serena lifted her head to look at him, surprised by how natural the idea sounded. "I've wanted to marry you since about 3 months into our relationship 5 years ago," Wallace admitted. "I just didn't know how to ask for something I thought would complicate my carefully ordered life. Now I know that marriage to you wouldn't complicate my life, it would complete it." They talked until nearly dawn, sharing dreams and fears and the practical details of blending their lives. They talked about Julian's shyness and Louis's tendency to have nightmares during thunderstorms. They talked about Wallace's desire to learn to cook and Serena's secret dream of opening her own art studio. As the first rays of sunlight began to paint the eastern sky, Serena felt herself drifting towards sleep, safe and warm in Wallace's arms. The kiss that had started everything was just the beginning, she realized. The real magic was in this. The quiet conversations and shared dreams and the growing certainty that they were building something stronger than what they'd had before. "Wallace?" she murmured against his chest. I love you too. I think I always have, even when I was trying not to." His arms tightened around her, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. "Sleep, sweetheart. I'll be here when you wake up." And for the first time in 5 years, Serena believed it completely. Chapter 8. The Test of True Love. In crisis, we discover not who we wish we were, but who we truly are. And sometimes love is strong enough to bridge that gap. The call came at 3:17 in the morning, Serena's panicked voice cutting through Wallace's deep sleep like a blade through silk. "Wallace, something's wrong with Louis. His fever spiked to 104 and he's not responding like he should. I'm taking him to the hospital now." Wallace was already reaching for his clothes before she finished speaking, his heart hammering against his ribs with a terror he'd never experienced. "I'll meet you there." "Which hospital?" "Willowbrook General. Please hurry." The line went dead, leaving Wallace alone in the guest room where he'd been sleeping for the past week, ever since that moonlit conversation that had changed everything between them. He dressed in record time, his hands shaking as he pulled on jeans and grabbed his keys. The drive to the hospital was a blur of empty roads and frantic prayers to a God he wasn't sure he believed in, bargaining with the universe for the health of a child who'd become his entire world in just 3 months. Louis, sweet, silly Louis, who gave the best hugs and saw magic in everything from butterflies to bedtime stories. The little boy who'd accepted him as Daddy without question, who'd crawled into his lap that very evening to show him a drawing of their family, complete with stick-figure smiles and a sun that took up half the page. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty at this hour, but Wallace spotted Serena's car immediately. She'd parked crooked across 2 spaces, the door left ajar in her haste to get Louis inside. The sight of that abandoned car, evidence of her panic and fear, made Wallace's chest constrict with helpless rage at the universe for threatening their child. Their child. The possessive thought came naturally now, no longer strange or foreign. Louis was his son in every way that mattered, and the idea of anything happening to him was unbearable. The emergency room was harshly lit and antiseptic, filled with the controlled chaos of medical professionals dealing with the night's casualties. Wallace found Serena in the pediatric waiting area, pacing like a caged animal, her dark hair disheveled, and her clothes, the same paint-stained t-shirt and sleep shorts she'd worn to bed, wrinkled from her hasty departure. Serena. He crossed to her in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms before she could protest. She collapsed against him with a sob of relief, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. "He was burning up," she whispered against his chest. "I gave him medicine, tried to cool him down with wet cloths, but nothing worked. He was so listless, Wallace. He barely opened his eyes when I picked him up. What if—" "Shh." Wallace stroked her hair, trying to offer comfort, while his own fear threatened to consume him. "He's going to be okay. Louis is strong, and he's getting the best care possible." "Where's Julian?" he asked, suddenly realizing they were alone. "Phoenix took him to her house. I didn't want to wake him unless... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Wallace understood. Unless it was serious enough that Julian needed to say goodbye to his twin. The thought was so horrific that Wallace physically recoiled from it. Mrs. Galbraith. A young doctor in scrubs approached them, and Wallace felt Serena stiffen at the name. They weren't married, weren't legally anything more than co-parents, but in this moment of crisis, the assumption felt right, natural. "I'm Dr. Martinez," the physician continued. "Louis is stable for now. We're running tests to determine the cause of his fever, but I want to be honest with you, his temperature is dangerously high, and we're having trouble bringing it down with conventional methods." Serena's knees buckled, and Wallace caught her, holding her upright through sheer force of will. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "It means we're going to admit him for observation and try more aggressive cooling measures. The good news is that he's responding to our interventions. His fever has dropped to 102.5, which is still high, but much better than when he arrived. We just need to figure out what's causing it." "Can we see him?" Serena asked, her voice barely audible. "One at a time, and only for a few minutes. He needs rest, but I understand you want to be close to him." Serena looked at Wallace with eyes full of tears. "You go first. I need a minute to pull myself together. He'll be scared if he sees me like this." Wallace wanted to protest, wanted to insist that she go first, because she was Louis's mother, the constant in his life, the one he'd want to see. But he also understood her need to compose herself, to be strong for their son. The pediatric ICU was quieter than the main emergency room, filled with the soft beeping of monitors and the hushed voices of nurses making their rounds. Louis looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, dwarfed by the machines surrounding him. IV lines snaked from his little arms, and his dark hair was damp with sweat, despite the cooling blanket draped over his small body. But his eyes, those brilliant blue eyes he'd inherited from Wallace, opened when he heard footsteps, and a weak smile crossed his fever-flushed face. "Daddy." His voice was hoarse, smaller than usual but alert. "You came." "Of course I came." Wallace moved to the bedside, careful not to disturb any of the medical equipment as he reached for Louis's hand. The small fingers that curled around his were burning hot despite the cooling measures, and Wallace had to swallow hard against the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "How are you feeling, buddy?" "Tired and hot. The doctors gave me medicine that tastes yucky." Louis's face scrunched in distaste. "Where's Mama?" "She's right outside. She'll be in to see you in just a minute." Wallace smoothed Louis's damp hair back from his forehead, the gesture as natural as breathing. "Julian's staying with Phoenix tonight so he can get some sleep." "Is Julian scared?" Louis asked with the concern for his twin that never failed to amaze Wallace. Even sick and frightened, Louis was worried about his brother. A little, Wallace admitted, but Phoenix is taking good care of him, and we'll call him as soon as you're feeling better. Daddy? Lewis's voice was getting drowsy, the medication and exhaustion taking their toll. Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad you're here. I was scared when I woke up and felt so sick, but Mama said you were coming, and I knew everything would be okay. The simple trust in those words nearly broke Wallace entirely. This child, his child, had complete faith in him, believed that his presence could make everything better. The responsibility of that trust was staggering and precious and terrifying all at once. I'll always come when you need me, Wallace promised, his voice thick with emotion. Always, Lewis, no matter what. Louis smiled, his eyes drifting closed. I love you, Daddy. I love you too, son, more than you'll ever know. Wallace stayed until Lewis's breathing evened out in sleep, then reluctantly made his way back to the waiting room where Serena was sitting with her head in her hands, looking small and lost and utterly exhausted. He's asking for you, Wallace said, settling beside her. He's tired but alert, and his fever has come down a little more. Serena nodded, wiping her eyes. Was he scared? A little. But mostly he was worried about Julian, and he wanted to make sure you were okay. Wallace reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. He said he was glad I was here, that he knew everything would be okay because you told him I was coming. Fresh tears spilled down Serena's cheeks. He's always been like that, so trusting, so sure that the people who love him will take care of him. Sometimes I worry that the world will break that faith. Not if we can help it, Wallace said firmly. We'll make sure he never has to doubt that he's loved and protected. Serena looked at him then, really looked at him, and Wallace saw something shift in her expression. You mean that, don't you? This isn't just about proving something to me or earning your way back into our lives. You really love them. They're my children, Wallace said simply, not because of DNA or legal documents, but because they've claimed my heart completely. Lewis and Julian are the best parts of me, the parts I didn't even know existed until I met them. I would do anything for them, Serena, anything. Even if loving them means dealing with nights like this, hospital visits and fevers, and the constant worry that comes with being a parent. Wallace thought about the terror he'd felt during the drive to the hospital, the way his heart had stopped when he'd seen Louis so small and sick in that hospital bed. It had been the worst 3 hours of his life, but also the most clarifying. Especially then, he said, the fear, the worry, the sleepless nights. That's not a burden, Serena. That's love. That's what it means to have people in your life who matter more than your own comfort or convenience. Serena studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because her shoulders relaxed for the first time since he'd arrived. I need to go see him, she said, standing. But Wallace, thank you. For coming, for staying, for being exactly what he needed tonight. Where else would I be? Wallace asked, genuinely puzzled. He's my son, and you're everything to me. This is where I belong. After Serena disappeared into the pediatric unit, Wallace found himself alone with his thoughts in the waiting room. The events of the night had crystallized something that had been building for months, the absolute certainty that this was his family, his life, his home. Not the penthouse in Seattle or the business he'd built, but this chaotic, beautiful, sometimes terrifying world of loving Serena and Julian and Louis with everything he had. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Phoenix. Louis is stable. Fever coming down. Will call with updates. Thank you for taking care of Julian. Her response came immediately. Thank God. Julian's asleep, but I'll tell him his brother is okay when he wakes up. You're a good man, Wallace. Serena's lucky to have you. The simple validation from Serena's fiercest protector meant more than Wallace could have imagined. Phoenix had been skeptical of him from the beginning, watching him with sharp eyes and protective instincts. Her approval felt like a milestone, a sign that he was finally becoming the man his family deserved. When Serena returned from her visit with Louis, she looked more at peace. "He's sleeping comfortably," she reported. "Dr. Martinez thinks it might be a viral infection, something that will run its course in a few days, but needs to be monitored carefully because of how high his fever spiked." "So he'll be okay?" Wallace asked, needing to hear the words. "He'll be okay," Serena confirmed, then surprised him by curling up beside him on the uncomfortable waiting room chair, her head finding its place on his shoulder. "The doctor said we can stay with him tonight, take turns, so one of us is always there when he wakes up." "Whatever you need," Wallace said, wrapping his arms around her. "I'm not going anywhere." They spent the night in shifts, one of them always at Lewis's bedside, while the other tried to rest in the waiting room. Wallace had never experienced anything like the vigil of hospital parenthood, the constant alertness, the way every change in breathing or movement could send your heart racing, the fierce protectiveness that made you want to trade places with your sick child without hesitation. By morning, Lewis's fever had broken completely, and he was sitting up asking for pancakes and wondering if the hospital had any good coloring books. The transformation from sick child to his usual energetic self was so dramatic that Wallace found himself laughing with relief and exhaustion. "Can we go home now?" Louis asked as doctor. Martinez completed his morning examination. "I want to see Julian and show him the cool bandages they put on my arms." "I think we can arrange that, doctor," Martinez smiled. "Your fever's been normal for 8 hours and all your tests came back reassuring. You'll need to take it easy for a few days, but there's no reason you can't recover at home." The drive back to Willowbrook was quiet, Louis dozing in his car seat while Serena sat beside Wallace in the passenger seat, her hand resting on his thigh in a gesture of intimacy that felt earned after the night they'd shared. "Thank you," she said quietly as they pulled into her driveway. "For what?" "For being there, for staying, for proving that when it really matters, you're exactly the father our boys need." Wallace looked at her, this incredible woman who'd given him the greatest gifts of his life, and felt something settle permanently in his chest, the absolute certainty that they belonged together, that they could weather any storm as long as they faced it united. "Thank you for letting me be their father," he said, "for giving me the chance to love them, to love you, for forgiving me enough to let me prove that I've changed." As they carried a sleepy Louis into the house where Julian was waiting with Phoenix, both boys immediately wrapping their arms around their brother and father in a tangle of relief and love, Wallace knew that last night had been more than a medical crisis. It had been a test of his commitment, his love, his willingness to be present for the hard moments as well as the easy ones. And somehow, miraculously, he'd passed. Chapter 9. Almost there, but not quite. The space between almost and always is where hearts learn to trust again, one careful breath at a time. 3 weeks had passed since Lewis's hospital stay, and the rhythm of their new life had settled into something that felt like destiny. Wallace no longer returned to the hotel each night. Serena's guest room had become his unofficial residence, though they both pretended it was temporary. But nothing felt temporary about the way Julian and Louis had absorbed their father into every corner of their existence. Wallace was the one they ran to with scraped knees, the steady presence at bedtime, the patient teacher showing them how to tie shoes and ride bikes. "Papa Wallace!" Louis burst through the kitchen door, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Come see the bird's nest we found in the fort." "Real baby birds," Julian added, appearing behind his brother. "They're so tiny and perfect." Wallace looked up from washing breakfast dishes, feeling the familiar warmth that came with being needed, being home. "That sounds amazing. We'll look later from a safe distance so we don't scare Mama Bird." The boys raced off to wash their hands, their excited chatter echoing through the cottage. Wallace watched them go with the mixture of pride and fierce protectiveness that had become his constant companion. "They found the robin's nest," Serena said, appearing in the kitchen doorway wearing a soft yellow sundress that made her skin glow. After 3 months of careful boundaries, she'd begun to relax around him again, and moments like this felt achingly natural. "They're very excited," Wallace confirmed, pouring her coffee in the mug that had somehow become hers. "You're beautiful this morning." "Thank you." She accepted the coffee with a smile that made his chest tighten with longing. "You're good with them, Wallace. Better than I dared hope." The praise still warmed him more than it should have. Serena's approval mattered desperately, her opinion of his fathering skills, the measure by which he judged his success. After breakfast and getting the boys ready for day camp, Wallace found himself pacing the living room like a caged animal. Living in Serena's house, sharing meals and bedtime routines, had shown him exactly what their life could be like together. But they existed in limbo. More than friends, less than lovers. "You're wearing a hole in my rug," Serena observed from the kitchen table where she worked on lesson plans. "Sorry." Wallace forced himself to sit, but his leg bounced with nervous energy. "I'm thinking about us. About this arrangement we've settled into." Serena's hand stilled on her pencil. "What about it?" "It feels temporary," Wallace said carefully, "like we're both holding back instead of making decisions about what we want our future to look like. I thought we were taking things slowly." "We're a family in every way except the ones that matter most," Wallace said, standing and crossing to her. "Julian and Louis call me Daddy. I'm here every morning and night. We make decisions together about everything. But we're not really together, Serena. Not the way I want us to be." She set down her pencil entirely, giving him her full attention. "What do you want, Wallace?" "I want to buy us a house," he said, the words tumbling out. "Big enough for all of us, with a workshop where I can teach the boys carpentry and a studio where you can paint. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night." Serena went very still, her face cycling through emotions too quickly for Wallace to interpret. "I want to marry you," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "Not because it's practical, but because loving you and Julian and Louis is the only thing that makes sense in my life anymore. I want to be your husband, officially and completely." The silence that followed was deafening. Serena stared at him, her eyes wide with something that might have been panic. "Wallace," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I know it's a lot," he said quickly. "But Serena, we've been dancing around this for months. The boys are happy. We're happy when we stop overthinking everything. What are we waiting for?" "I need time," Serena said, standing abruptly and putting distance between them. "You're talking about changing everything and I can't. I need to think." The words hit Wallace like a physical blow. He'd expected surprise, maybe even joy. He hadn't expected retreat. "Time for what?" he asked, trying to keep the hurt out of his voice. "We've had 3 months to see how this works. 3 months of me proving I'm not going anywhere. What else do you need to know?" "I need to know that when the novelty wears off, when parenting gets hard and routine, you won't wake up one morning and remember why you said you never wanted children," Serena said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "How many times do I have to show you that I've changed?" Wallace asked, his own emotions breaking free. "How many bedtime stories, how many hospital vigils before you believe I'm not that man anymore?" "It's not about what you've shown me," Serena shot back, tears threatening. "It's about what happens when this stops being new and exciting. When Julian doesn't want to listen, or Louis has problems, or I'm tired and cranky, and not the woman you fell in love with. Then we'll handle it together," Wallace said, his voice softening. "Like families do. Serena, I've noticed that Louis had 3 tantrums this week, that Julian's been testing boundaries, That you were exhausted yesterday. I noticed all of it, and I'm still here. I'm still asking you to marry me." Serena blinked in surprise, as if she hadn't realized he'd been paying such close attention. "That's what love is," Wallace continued. "Not just wanting someone when they're perfect, but choosing them every day, even when they're not." "What if you change your mind?" The question came out small, broken. "Then you'll leave me," Wallace said simply. "But I won't change my mind. These past 3 months haven't been me playing house. They've been me discovering who I really am when I'm with the people I love most." Serena was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she struggled with emotions warring in her expression. "I'm scared," she whispered, terrified that if I let myself believe this is real, if I let the boys believe it's permanent, and then something goes wrong. "Something might go wrong," Wallace agreed, crossing to her and taking her hands. "But Serena, something might go right too. Something might be better than either of us ever imagined." He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing gentle kisses to her knuckles. "I'm asking you to take a leap of faith with someone who loves you completely." "That's what scares me most," she whispered, looking up at him with eyes bright with unshed tears. "That I want it, all of it, so desperately that it physically hurts. I want to wake up beside you and plan our future together and give Julian and Louis the kind of home I dreamed about when I was pregnant and alone. I want it so much that I'm afraid wanting it will jinx it somehow." Wallace felt something tight in his chest loosen at her words. This wasn't rejection. This was fear, and fear he could work with. "So let's want it together," he said, pulling her close. "Let's be terrified together, and brave together, and build something beautiful together." Serena melted into his embrace, her face buried against his chest, clinging to him as if he might disappear if she let go. "I need time," she said again, but this time it didn't sound like rejection. It sounded like someone gathering courage for the biggest leap of their life. "How much time?" Wallace asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Not long. I just need to get used to the idea that we might actually get our happy ending after all." From upstairs came the sound of small feet and Louis's voice calling out, "Mama? Daddy? Julian had another bad dream, and now I'm awake too." Serena laughed through her tears, wiping her face as she pulled away from Wallace. "That's our cue. This conversation isn't over," Wallace said, but his tone was gentle, understanding. "I know," Serena replied, and for the first time since he'd started talking about houses and marriage, she looked hopeful instead of terrified. "But Wallace, when I'm ready, when I can finally believe that we get to keep this, the answer is going to be yes." The smile that spread across Wallace's face was radiant, transforming his entire expression with joy and relief. "Yeah? Yeah," Serena confirmed, standing on her toes to press a quick, sweet kiss to his lips. "Now come on, let's go deal with whatever crisis is waiting for us upstairs." As they climbed the stairs together to comfort their sons, Wallace felt a peace settle over him that he'd never experienced before. They weren't there yet, weren't quite ready to make the leap into forever, but they were close, so close he could almost taste it, and for now, almost was enough. Chapter 10. Forever Starts Now. The most beautiful love stories don't end with "I do." They begin there, in the sacred space where two people choose each other every day for the rest of their lives. The morning of Julian and Louis's 6th birthday dawned clear and bright, with golden September light that made everything look painted by angels. Serena stood at her kitchen window, watching Wallace and the boys set up tables in the backyard for the party, and felt her heart so full of love, she wondered how her chest could contain it all. 6 months had passed since that conversation about houses and marriage. 6 months of carefully building trust and intimacy, and the deep certainty that they were meant to be a family. Wallace had been patient with her fears, gentle with her hesitations, never pushing but always present, always proving through actions that his commitment was unshakable. The guest room had long since been abandoned. Wallace now slept beside her in the bed they'd chosen together for the new house they'd bought just outside Willowbrook, a rambling Victorian with enough space for everyone to grow and dream. They'd moved in 3 weeks ago, the boys bouncing with excitement as they explored their new rooms and possibilities. "Mama!" Louis burst through the kitchen door, his face flushed with excitement and his party clothes already wrinkled. "Daddy says the surprise is almost ready. Can we show you now, please?" "What surprise?" Serena asked, though she'd been aware of the secret planning sessions and whispered conversations. "The best surprise in the whole world," Julian added, appearing behind his brother with careful composure. "But you have to close your eyes and let us lead you outside." Serena looked at her sons, these beautiful boys who'd grown so much in the past year, not just in height, but in confidence and security, and felt the familiar swell of fierce love that motherhood had brought to her life. "Close my eyes?" she repeated skeptically. "You know how I feel about surprises." "This is a good surprise," Louis assured her with absolute certainty. "The best surprise ever, and you're going to cry happy tears and everything." "Happy tears?" Serena laughed, but she allowed herself to be led to the back door, her eyes obediently closed. "You can open them now." Serena opened her eyes and gasped. The backyard had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. White lights were strung between the trees, creating a canopy of stars despite the afternoon sunshine. Tables draped in soft blue linens held wildflower arrangements and birthday treats. But it was the centerpiece that made her breath catch. Under the ancient oak tree where Wallace had hung a swing last week, he stood in a charcoal grey suit that made his blue eyes impossibly bright, holding a small velvet box and wearing an expression of such love and hope that Serena felt her knees go weak. "Surprise!" Louis shouted, bouncing on his toes. "Daddy's going to ask you to marry him, and we helped pick out the ring and everything." "Louis!" Julian hissed with exasperation. "You weren't supposed to tell her that part." But Serena barely heard their exchange, her entire attention focused on Wallace as he crossed the yard to where she stood, frozen in shock and wonder and joy that made the world seem brighter. "Serena," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he dropped to one knee, the boys immediately flanking him. "6 months ago, you told me you needed time to believe that we get to keep this. I hope I've given you enough reasons to believe it now." Serena's hands flew to her mouth, tears already spilling as she stared at this man who'd become everything she'd never dared dream she could have. "These past months of living together, of building our home and our life side by side, have been the happiest of my existence," Wallace continued, his voice gaining strength. "Not because they were perfect, we've had our moments of chaos and frustration, but because they were ours. Because we faced every challenge together, celebrated every joy together, learned how to be a family together." "Daddy," Louis whispered loudly, "you're supposed to open the ring box now." Wallace laughed, a sound full of nerves and love and happiness. "Thank you for the reminder, buddy." He opened the velvet box to reveal a ring that was absolutely perfect. A vintage solitaire surrounded by smaller diamonds that caught the afternoon light and threw rainbows across the grass. "Serena Bunn," Wallace said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Will you marry me? Will you let me love you and Julian and Louis for the rest of my life? Will you build forever with me?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with history and hope and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. Serena looked at Wallace's face, at the absolute devotion in his expression, at Julian and Louis watching with bright, expectant eyes, at the backyard they'd created together full of lights and flowers and possibilities. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, with more certainty than she'd ever felt about anything. "Yes, Wallace. Yes to all of it." The boys cheered as Wallace slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook only slightly. And then he was standing and pulling her into his arms and kissing her with 5 years of separation and 6 months of rebuilding and a lifetime of promises, all poured into one perfect moment. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "I love you so much, it scares me sometimes." "I love you too," Serena replied, her arms tight around his neck. "I love the man you've become, the father you are to our boys, the partner you've been to me." "Does this mean we're going to have a wedding?" Julian asked with practical concern. "The biggest, most beautiful wedding ever," Lewis declared, "with cake and dancing and pretty flowers." "Whatever kind of wedding your mama wants," Wallace said, his arms still around Serena. "As long as at the end of it we're married, I don't care about anything else." "I want our friends to be there," Serena said, already imagining the celebration. "Phoenix and Aurelia and all the people who helped us get to this moment. I want it to be joyful and beautiful and full of love." "Can we be in the wedding?" Louis asked hopefully. "Can we carry rings or flowers?" "You're the most important part," Wallace assured him. "Both of you. This isn't just about your mama and me getting married. It's about us becoming a family, officially, legally, permanently." "We're already a family," Julian observed with characteristic wisdom. "This just makes it so everyone else knows it too." "Exactly right," Serena agreed, kneeling to hug both boys. "We're already a family in our hearts. Now we're going to make it official." The party that followed was everything a 6th birthday should be, noisy and chaotic and full of laughter. Phoenix arrived and immediately burst into tears at the sight of Serena's ring. Aurelia brought homemade cake and sage advice about marriage. The neighbors came with gifts and well-wishes, and through it all, Wallace and Serena moved together with the natural rhythm of people who belong to each other completely. As evening fell and the last guests departed, they found themselves alone with Julian and Louis in their backyard, surrounded by the detritus of celebration and deep contentment. "Best birthday ever," Louis declared, sprawled on the grass in his party clothes, looking exhausted but blissful. "The best part wasn't even the presents," Julian added thoughtfully. "It was seeing Mama and Daddy get engaged." "You guys are pretty amazing, you know that?" Wallace said, settling beside them on the blanket Serena had spread under the oak tree. "Why would we be jealous?" Louis asked, genuinely confused. "We wanted you to marry Mama. We asked you to, remember?" Serena curled up beside Wallace, her head on his shoulder, her hand with its new ring resting on his chest, where she could feel his heartbeat steady and strong. "What are you thinking about?" Wallace asked softly. "Everything," Serena replied. "How scared I was when you first showed up in my garden, how certain I was that letting you into our lives would end in heartbreak. How wrong I was about so many things." "You weren't wrong to be scared," Wallace said. "I hadn't earned your trust yet. I had to prove that I'd changed, that I was worthy of you and Julian and Louis." "You proved it," Serena said firmly. "Every day, in 1,000 small ways, you proved it." Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear, and the boys' voices were getting drowsy as the excitement finally caught up with them. This was happiness, Serena realized. Not breathless passion or desperate intensity, but this quiet contentment, this certainty that tomorrow would bring more of the same. "When should we have the wedding?" she asked, surprising herself. "Whenever you want," Wallace replied. "Tomorrow, next month, next year. I'm not going anywhere." "Soon," Serena decided. "I don't want to wait anymore. I've spent too many years being afraid of what might go wrong instead of embracing what might go right." "Soon it is," Wallace agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Mama? Daddy?" Julian's voice was sleepy, content. "Are we going to live happily ever after now, like in the stories?" Serena and Wallace exchanged a look full of love and promise and hard-won wisdom. "Yes, sweetheart," Serena said softly. "We're going to live happily ever after." All of us together, Wallace added, forever and always. Louis was already asleep on the blanket, his small hand curled trustingly in his father's, and Julian was fighting to keep his eyes open. Above them, the stars grew brighter, and around them, their forever home waited to shelter all the ordinary miracles that would make up their life together. 5 years ago, Wallace had said he never wanted children, and those words had shattered Serena's world. Tonight, surrounded by the children who'd changed everything and holding the woman who'd taught him what love really meant, Wallace understood that some mistakes become the foundation for miracles. Sometimes the words that break us apart are exactly what we need to become whole. Sometimes never becomes always, and always becomes forever. The end.